Hello and welcome to Wide Angle This Week. The International Solar Alliance's first meeting took place in Delhi this week, co-chaired by India and France. The Prime Minister kicked off the proceedings by saying that solar energy, particularly created amongst the countries as part of this alliance, would give OPEC a run for its money. What exactly did he mean by that? And to talk about the challenges of climate change and the need for renewable energy, we have with us on the show the French Minister for the Environment, Brune Poisson. Thank you very much for being on our show. My first question to you, first of all, welcome to India as well, but I believe you're familiar with the landscape around Delhi in
You're
particular.
never familiar enough with India, but it's always a great pleasure to be here.
Nice to have you here. The Prime Minister at the meeting, when he sort of kicked off the ISA meeting yesterday, has been quoted as saying that this would pose a challenge to OPEC. Now, people are a little unsure of what that means, because OPEC, you drill oil, you put it in a pipeline, you put it on a barrel, on a ship. There's ways to transport this oil as energy. Whereas with solar energy, we're not sure what he meant. Maybe you can enlighten us.
I think it's a great political vision, and one that, in the broad lines, we share, France and India. Why? Because in France, we just passed a law that says that it's going to be forbidden to exploit hydrocarbons or fossil fuels by 2040. We believe very strongly that fossil fuels should remain in the soil, that we should not exploit it anymore. And so what Prime Minister Modi actually meant was that solar energy and renewable energy are the energies of the future, and that we need to do our very best to accelerate the speed and scale of development of that sort of technologies. And the International Solar Alliance is the best place to do that, and it's all part of the mandate. And I think it's a great political vision, because it really shows that now fossil fuels should be over. And it's time to really focus on developing renewable energy.
But I think the question I was trying to ask you is this, that when you say that it's going to be a challenge to an existing system of energy providers, I mean, OPEC is a cartel of nations. It's a group of nations that are oil producing and oil exporting countries.
Yes.
How do you export solar energy? I mean, what is the meaning of that statement? I think to make it more understandable to the common man, because everyone's looking at this and saying, okay, I like the sound of the fact that it's the answer to OPEC, but how does that really work on the ground?
So I think two things. First of all, the International Solar Alliance is a group of countries as well.
Yeah.
First. And second, you need to compare things that can be really compared. And you were talking about systems. Mm-hmm. These are two different systems. So generally, we could compare them. But then when you look at the technologies, we are working on that. We're working on developing, and we're doing that with India. We are working on developing a host of solar energy projects and working also on storage. Mm-hmm. And countries such as, African countries potentially could provide energy to the rest of the world, or at least to parts of, for example, Europe, which is just across the sea. So this is a kind of vision, and we need that.
So in that providing of energy to other parts of the world,
yes,
what would be the connectivity source for solar energy?
So, when going back to comparing really apples to apples, it's also that when we talk about renewable energies, and it's the whole point of the International Solar Alliance, we also talk about very local projects.
Right, okay.
So yes, on the one hand, we may be able to actually transport solar energy, because we will have created the storage systems to do that. But these are also very local projects. Of grid, for example, with a host of villages and even families that will have access to a very small unit of renewable energies. And that's the type of solutions that we're currently working on.
One of the other challenges for solar energy in a country like India, while yes, we're between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, and we have, we're close to the equator, and we have a lot of sunshine for a large part of the year. we don't have the kind of space that solar energy requires. I mean, the panels are large. I mean, if someone were to tell me that here's your phone and you can put in a panel this size in your home for solar energy, I might be incentivized to use it with the costs and the size, etc., keeping that in mind. Here, when we talk about solar energy, the vision that comes to mind is these large panels atop buildings or in vast tracts of land, and they're expensive. They're expensive to acquire, they're expensive to maintain. So how do you make this accessible?
You know, a body such as, or an organization such as the International Solar Alliance can provide answers to that, because it provides scale, and it is with scale that you have the space to do research and development. You're right, solar energy takes a lot of space, and it can be expensive. But we also know that we need to work on technologies, and some of them are already emerging. Technologies that are, for example, it could be windows that are made of solar panels. It could be rooftops. The productivity also of solar energy is increasing very fast. And the more you develop such projects also, the lower the cost becomes. And we can see it, you know, I'm so impressed to see that the cost of renewable energy, and in particular solar energy, is falling down so fast. I have to say, when I'm in France, I very often like to describe what's going on in India when it comes to renewable energy and the development of solar energy. You know, prices are falling, and it's booming, it's fast developing. I have to say, I'm very impressed.
So I think India's commitment to renewable energy is something that has been apparent to many people in the world, and certainly many Indians. We are trying to be conservationists now inherently, but the idea of the Solar Alliance was also sort of an offshoot of the Paris Agreement, where countries like India and China, but we'll stick to India for the moment, essentially talked about ways to mitigate their carbon footprint in the world, look for renewable energy. The Paris Agreement was sort of held up as a beacon of how the world is going to move towards better use of energy. France was leading that initiative. We've had the United States pull out of it. So on the one hand, Indians are sitting here and saying, you can't convince the biggest, strongest, richest country in the world to be part of an agreement and sign on to a commitment to, address the issues of climate change and carbon emissions, and you want all of us to do it. We seem to be back at square one as well.
Well, no. I can see that, you know, the fact that a country such as the United States deciding to leave the Paris Agreement is something which we need to take seriously. It's a piece of bad news, yes. But on the other hand, a lot has been happening. First of all, the fact that the US decided to pull out of the Paris Agreement didn't lead to many nations around the world leaving the Paris Agreement, which means that it remains a very strong framework and a very strong sort of foundations on which all countries, you know, can base their public policies and their technology developments on. So we think it's a great thing, first. And we keep working on maintaining the spirit of the Paris Agreement alive, first. Second, I think the decision of President Trump pushed us for more action. And that's one of the reasons why President Macron, the day we got the news that President Trump decided to pull out of the Paris Agreement, decided to launch the One Planet Summit. It was basically a call for action, where he asked all organizations, you know, companies, NGOs, countries, cities that were willing to do more, to come to Paris, gather, and just take a step further. And make important commitments. And there were some very important announcements that were made in Paris on December 12th, 2017. For example, China decided that it was going to launch a carbon market. For example, the International Solar Alliance was a key part of the event. And there is a host of examples that I'm not going to describe here. And all this really was and catalyzed action. And then we had a second edition of the One Planet Summit on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, where we took stock and we looked at where the projects were at. Most importantly, what this One Planet Summit is all about It's about shifting in a massive way private investments towards low carbon projects and projects that are good for the planet. That's what we need to do now. We need to have a change of scale. And that's the vision of President Macron. It's from going to billions of dollars invested in low carbon projects to trillions. That's what we're working on. And it's typically the whole spirit and the whole idea behind the International Solar Alliance.
Right. On the one hand, you're saying that Donald Trump's pullout from the Paris Agreement sort of pushed other countries to reinforce and reaffirm their commitments towards clean energy, towards addressing the concerns around climate change. As the Solar Alliance meetings were taking place in Delhi, we've also had the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in Delhi the same time, making the point that while climate change remains a key priority for the United Nations, superpowers need to do their role. So I think while we can say that Donald Trump's exit has made us sort of reaffirm our commitment, I don't think an agreement overall or new strategies are entirely feasible without the United States. Do you think that's possible?
I think the more countries we have on board, the better it is. I'm not going to tell you that it was a good news. But I think we can still do a lot, and a lot is happening. Look at what France and India are doing with the International Solar Alliance. Look at all the policies that the Indian government has put in place. I was very, very positively shocked to see the figures of the development of renewable energy, for example, in India. So I think there's a lot of action happening at all levels around the world. Whether it's enough, no. We can always do more. We should be doing more. But I think also what is particularly interesting for a country such as France to be working so closely with India is the whole idea that the ecological transition has to be also inclusive. It has to be a transition which is affordable to all.
Right, and that's a big challenge.
And that's a big challenge, but that is exactly what we're working on. Making the transition both ecological but also affordable for all. Otherwise, we won't be able to meet the challenge of climate change.
And in order to meet the challenge of climate change, while France and India are working together, how does France, which is leading the international conversations on this, propose to bring the US back into the system? Do you have a plan?
So we know the US is more than welcome at any time to come back to the Paris Agreement. And frankly speaking, and President Macron has said it already, we think that they will, at some point, come back to the Paris Agreement. But what is absolutely critical is to insist on the fact that the Paris Agreement is non-negotiable. It is the way it is now, and we won't change it. It's a strong foundation for all nations around the world. And most nations, all nations, to have signed it, have decided to keep being part of the Paris Agreement. And I think this is what we need to look at. And if one decides to leave, it's a real pity. We think it's a shame. Yeah. But we also believe that at some point the US will be part of it again.
So are there conversations going on between Paris and Washington, D.C. to ensure that happens?
We feel it's a general conversation that we're having on climate change, on the absolute necessity of curbing CO2 emissions. And I had conversations with my counterparts. And I think the US is very much aware that it needs to tackle it's the growth of its CO2 emissions. Yeah. And now it's a decision that belongs to the American government. It's not for me to decide on their behalf. Okay.
So now going from here, I mean, we've seen the first meeting that's taken place in Delhi. It sort of kicked off with a lot of pomp and ceremony. Several ministers from many of the participating nations were present for this. What will France's role continue to be in this? Because I think given the expenses involved, many of the countries between the tropics are also developing countries and are looking to the West and looking to richer countries for assistance, financial assistance in this regard to develop these strategies. Is that something, I mean, how much would France sign on to?
as I started the conversation by telling you that what we need is trillions. Trillions.
Yeah.
So what it means basically is that all around the world, we absolutely need to focus on making sure that the private sector, and most importantly, financial investors, actually use their money to fight climate change. It's a moral issue. It is a moral issue.
So you want to get the private sector involved?
Absolutely, absolutely. And not only we want, but we are determined to do that. You know, in the 19th century, some financial institutions financed slavery. I don't want to tell my daughter that I was part of a system where, you know, financial institutions were actually financing coal power plants. I think it's a moral issue. So this is one of the reasons why the French government is very strongly working on actually making sure that money flows to low carbon projects. That said, we also know that we have a responsibility, and you know, as part of the Paris Agreement, you know, with the 100 billion pledged, we will continue to work on that and make sure it happens. It plays a central role in the international negotiations.
Okay, well, before we wrap up, because we're out of time, you made the point that you want to get the private sector involved much more in these projects. We also know that India and France have a very strong foundation of cooperation in many sectors, including defense. So I want to ask you, before I let you go, one last question on whether the latest controversies over the Rafale and France and India's comments, the former French president's comments on it, have in any way impacted your engagements or the overall relationship between France and India right now?
So as you know, I'm in charge of ecological transition.
Yes.
What I can tell you is that there was, and the agreement took place from government to government. Negotiations never dealt with industrial partnerships. French industries chose their Indian industrial partners on their own.
So are you saying that what the former French President Hollande said was incorrect?
No, I told you everything I can on the issue.
Okay, all right. Well, Brune Poisson, thank you very much. I know this is not your sector, but I had to sort of sneak the question in there nonetheless. Thank you very much for speaking to Wide Angle.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.